Welcome to this Trade Dialogues webinar on the GVC Development Report 2021. The report is the third edition of a biennial series and a co-publication by the Asian Development Bank, the Research Institute on Global Value Chains at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, the World Trade Organization, the Institute of Developing Economies at the Japan External Trade Organization, and the China Development Research Foundation. My name is Victor Stolzenburg. I'm a research economist in the Economic Research and Statistics Division in the WTO, and I will be your host for today. And we are very happy to start off this webinar with welcome remarks by Deputy Director Anabel Gonzalez. Anabel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Dear ladies and gentlemen, hello to every one of you. The World Trade Organization has been a proud contributor to the GVC Development Report since its first edition in 2017, and will continue to support it because research like this helps to provide the information our members need in their negotiations and in their aim to improve the living standards of people globally. Moreover, the series illustrates the benefits of collaboration across different institutions from different regions. 51 authors from 20 research institutions in 8 countries contributed 25 background papers that form the basis for this report. Such collective endeavors are key to provide inclusive policy advice that takes into account different regional and social perspectives. Combining our comparative strength to create synergies is the most effective way to harness the expertise, know-how, and knowledge that exists in our respective institutions and use it for the common good. Currently, in addition to immense human suffering, the war in Ukraine causes severe disruptions for global supply chains. And of course, we're still feeling the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic as highlighted by the current lockdowns in China. Only 1 month ago, we convened the Global Supply Chains Forum to begin the work of shaping sustainable, inclusive solutions to these problems. And today's webinar on the timely GVC Development Report brings important context to these developments by pointing to the underlying factors shaping global value chains. Firstly, the report shows that the growth of global value chains has stagnated since the financial crisis of 2009, that is, long before the pandemic hit. The GVC participation rate stood at 44.4% in 2020, relative to 46.1% in 2008. Different factors, from changes in the policy environment to technological advancements in automation, have put brakes on the growth of value chains, and the pandemic adds to it. The report discusses possible solutions that help make supply chains more resilient in the future. And it also showcases that despite these factors, supply chains have weathered the existing pandemic surprisingly well and have played a key role in supporting economic recovery by addressing the needs for food, essential medical goods, and the digital tools that have enabled us to move towards work-from-home solutions. Secondly, the report goes beyond examining current situation and discusses the larger trends underlying global value chains. Aptly entitled Beyond Production, the report illustrates how the reality of value chains is changing. They focus less and less on manufacturing and instead depend more and more on intangible products such as services and intellectual property. The implications of this for how value is generated and distributed through trade cannot be underestimated. Understanding exactly where in this value chains value is created and how it is shared among its actors is central to ensure that everyone obtains a fair share in the gains from trade. The report shows, for instance, that when trade is in intangible assets, and when trade in intangible assets is taken into account, China's trade surplus with the US is 32% lower than what is reported by traditional statistics due to the United States' large but unrecorded IP exports. It also shows that the rise of services value chains presents a new path to development. The IT sector in India, which is largely sustained by exports, supports up to 16 million workers and has generated more jobs than any other sector over the past 20 years. Many of these jobs went to women, and the report shows that this can explain around 10% of the gains in women's educational attainment rates. Trade must serve and improve the lives of everyone. It is not a goal in itself, but can be a powerful tool for better jobs and higher welfare. The research in this report provides the necessary insight from policymakers to reinvigorate the multilateral trading system in a way that supports this goal, in a way that ensures that no one is left behind, but that we enjoy shared prosperity. Let me close by wishing you a successful webinar and by encouraging everyone to read the report so that we can implement its recommendations and learn from the lessons it lays out. And I ask the research teams behind it to continue their analytical work and close the knowledge gaps we have. Understanding the structural shifts in GVCs and the world economy towards intangible assets is the task of not just one report, but of continued collaborative efforts. Thank you very much to all of you who participated in the production of this report, and thanks to our audience for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annabelle. We will now proceed. I will now proceed by presenting some of the key messages and findings of the report before I open up the panel discussion with the lead authors. So let me share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see the slides. Let me start with a little bit of background. So the GVC Development Report is 2021 was produced by 5 main partners who contributed 6 chapters over a 2-year period from 2019 to 2021, based on 25 background papers from 20 research institutions in 8 countries. To produce a 3rd edition of this biennial series. I'm highlighting this because, on the one hand, to show that this is a collaborative approach, but also to show that this is an open approach. And that's important for us because we are now in the early stages to produce a 2023 report. And we are really open to any recommendations or suggestions that you might be having as stakeholders. So feel free to reach out to any of us at any point in time to help us put the next edition of the report together. But coming back to the 2021 report, let's start with chapter 1. What we've always done in chapter 1 of the GVC development reports is to present an update on trends in global value chains, using the most up-to-date data that is available thanks to our colleagues at the Asian Development Bank, who were able to extend the data to 2020. And what the report shows is, of course, the by now well-known finding that GVCs expanded rapidly between 1995 and 2008 or 9, that is the financial crisis, and have been stagnating since or consolidating. In the last report, in the 2019 report, we saw a slight uptick in 2017 that made us relatively hopeful, also because trends like e-commerce and digitalization helped to reinvigorate GVCs, and that trend actually, as we can see here, continued in 2018, so that we would reach new peaks in GVC participation. But then, of course, trade conflicts and afterwards the COVID pandemic have disrupted that trend, and now participation has fallen back almost to the levels, at least in 2020, almost to the levels of the global financial crisis. That overall picture being what it is doesn't mean that we haven't seen some countries that still continue to have strong increases in GVC participation. Also since the financial crisis. There are examples such as Vietnam, Slovenia, or Romania, but also high-income countries such as Germany, which increased its participation ratio from 45% to 52% in the past decade. Now, of course, one of the major reasons that we see the aggregate picture, the stagnating aggregate picture, is that the GVC participation rate of China has actually slightly fallen in the last decade from 35% to 34%. One thing we always tend to do in chapter 1 of this report is trying to push the boundary of how we measure GVCs to get a better picture of GVC integration. And what we did in this report is to take a better look at multinational corporations, because depending on how you define global value chain participation, there are two activities of multinational corporations that could be considered GVC related, but that haven't been captured in the statistics so far. And these are in particular the local sales by foreign MNCs that are produced also locally, but also the exports of these multinationals. The reason being that so far GVC trade has been defined as trade in goods that cross at least two borders, which is of course not the case here. Nevertheless, given the invisible knowledge flows, and this is also the first time that this presentation is linked to the theme of the report, beyond production, this could also be considered as GVC trade. And once we include it, we see that this makes up about 9.3% of world GDP. And if this is added to the GVC participation rate, we reach a rate of 20.2% in GDP, as opposed to the 12% that I showed you earlier, which is almost a doubling. And in chapter 2, we look at how this plays out using a couple of examples. And in particular, the so-called factory-less manufacturers. And the reason for this is that these firms are essentially exporting services related to intangibles via tangibles produced by foreign contract manufacturers. And what that means is that essentially, because a lot of these linkages are not captured by trade or balance of payment statistics, because this is different from conventional trading services, and often there's no border crossing at all, we miss out quite an important part of the picture. And this table highlights this to some extent, because in column A, it lists the imports of China from the US in laptops and mobile phones. And as you can see, the values are very small. Also pay attention to the unit. We have here just millions of US dollars. On the other hand, if you look at the sales of Apple, a US company in China, we have, of course, gigantic values with between 50 and 60 billion dollars, and also the manufacturing cost of Apple in China is much larger than what the imports would highlight. And since, of course, a lot of the value added that is or that goes into the retail price of an iPhone goes eventually back to or stays with Apple and not within China, one could consider that this should be in some way recorded as an export, services export of the United States to China. And if we do this as an exercise, we see for a couple of factory-less manufacturers, and in particular Apple, Nike, Qualcomm, and AMD, we see that the official US services exports to China almost double from 57.1% to 80, from $57.1 billion to $85 billion. And in turn, the trade deficit between the US and China decreases by 7.3%. So what we do in what the report does in chapter 2 then is to apply this concept more broadly, which we refer to as trade and factor income, and define a country's exports as the sum of the incomes earned by the factors belonging to the country in foreign markets. And if we do that, we see that, for instance, China's trade surplus with the US is 32% lower on average than what it is in gross exports. And it's also more than 17% lower than what the standard value-added trade statistics have been showing. That is, with data such as TIVA and in the GVC reports, we have long shown that, you know, once you account for value-added trade, the bilateral trade deficits between countries, in particular high income and developing countries, tend to change. But once you additionally get account for this trade factor income, you get another huge push in this direction. What chapter 3 then does is to say, okay, if all this intangible, if all these intangible assets and essentially this knowledge is traveling along GVCs, we should see this as with respect to the productivity growth and the innovation that is related to GVCs. And in fact, the chapter does show that GVCs tend to lead to much larger knowledge spillovers than traditional trade. They seem to be a much better mediator of foreign innovation to domestic innovation, and in particular, so if the absorptive capacity of the receiving countries are high. And in line with this, we see that the income ratios between here 15 developing Asian economies and the OECD average, that these income ratios are converging. Interestingly, though, despite all this transfer of intangible assets and the knowledge flows, a lot of this still comes from the production income ratio, which are essentially assembly functions and manufacturing functions. But we can also see an uptick in the past decade with respect to the knowledge income ratio. And while the production income ratio seems to stagnate for a while now, the knowledge income ratio continues to go up. Now, a lot of these intangible assets, as I said, are of course related to services. So we decided in the report to also look at the role of global services value chains more broadly for services-led development. Because we think that services GVCs can offer a new path for development. Let me show you the previous slide just once more. We see a stagnation in the production income ratio between developing Asia and the OECD, for instance. That is, it seems to be possible that with assembly and these stages, you can only close the income gap by so far. While for services, we continue to see a rise. The example we looked at in the report in particular are the Philippines and India. And what we can see here are the employment and the revenue implications of these countries integrating into services GVCs. And as you can see, they are just tremendous employment in India and the Philippines went increased extremely over the past few years. These sectors have added more employment in these two countries than any other sector. And what we do in the chapter then is to link these facts to the discussion of, in particular, premature deindustrialization. That is the fear that if countries enter or join essentially services too early, they miss out on some of the important benefits of manufacturing-led development or industrialization. And one thing that we highlight in the report to show that this fear might be unwarranted is that we find that certain services increasingly share similar characteristics to manufacturing industries. And these are in particular scale economies and knowledge spillovers, but also the job creating capacity of some of these services, as we've seen on the previous slide. And importantly, the advantages of services GVCs relative to manufacturing GVCs that go beyond these employment and revenue factors. And that's, of course, the gender equality aspect. Services tend to be much more equal in terms of employment by gender. And one thing we find in the report, for instance, that services liberalization in India can account for almost 10% of the decline in the country's gender education gap. And related to this, we also know that services tend to be substantially greener than manufacturing. Of course, many of the IT-based services need a lot of electricity, but nevertheless, relative to a lot of the manufacturing sectors, services tend to be much greener. Now, of course, nothing comes with benefits only. So we also identify certain challenges, such as the skill intensity of services, which might widen the income inequality, and also the highly concentrated nature spatially, which might widen rural divides. And then finally, low-skill tasks of services GVCs are susceptible to automation, just as low-skill manufacturing GVCs. This is not a particular challenge of services GVCs. It's just important to point out that not all services tasks are knowledge-intensive, and therefore, which of course helps to make them employment-intensive, but it also means that they are more susceptible to automation. We've seen, or we identify this in particular with respect to some of the simpler BPO tasks, call centers, and so on in global value chains. This, of course, has some implications for policy, which to address essentially the challenges we have identified with respect to education, R&D spending, barriers to services trade, and so on. But I think one of the most important points that we try to make in the chapters is that we have seen an increase in services consumption in high-income countries and also increasingly in developing countries. That is happening independent of policy. COVID has been able to slow this down temporarily, but we believe this trend will continue. So rather than only considering what are the drawbacks of services-led development or premature deindustrialization, policymakers should probably be proactive, consider this as a fact, and prepare the economies for this development in order to reap the gains from it. Now let me jump to stick with the beyond production theme, chapter 5 for just a minute, and go straight to chapter 6. And what we did in this final chapter of the report is to look at the interaction of digital platforms and global value chains. The reason being, of course, the digital platforms have become ever more important, reaching 3.8 trillion in revenues in 2018. And even though these platforms are relatively skewed from a geographical perspective towards Asia, North America, and Europe, they are a large player. And while we lack still a lot of data on them, so the chapter is more conceptual, we do find that these platforms have created internet-driven value chains, which are diminishing the importance of brick and mortar retail stores. And that this has actually also a lot of relevant advantages for GVCs, in particular by making participation easier and lowering the cost of entering international markets. And that, of course, has positive implications for inclusivity by making it easier for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to join GVCs directly without needing a large firm as a mediator. Now, as is the case for services, also here, of course, there are challenges, in particular the monopolistic power of many digital platforms, but also the data security and the protection of consumer privacy on these platforms. And this gives me a nice transition to chapter 5, which is the last chapter, which looks at rising risks to GVCs. When we started the report and we set the theme to beyond production, we thought, nevertheless, we cannot ignore what was going on in 2019. These were, of course, these were mainly the trade conflicts. We hadn't foreseen the pandemic naturally, but of course the chapter then gave us an ideal opportunity to also discuss not just geopolitical tensions and the environment, but also health-related shocks and the pandemic. Starting with geopolitical shocks, which of course right now are at the forefront of everyone's minds. They have become a primary concern for the future of GVCs already for a while. According to standard measures of uncertainty, the conflict, for instance, the trade conflict between the United States and China has added 20% to global uncertainty in 2016. And while we haven't seen a lot of evidence for reshoring, there is it has affected trade, and it has affected GVCs. What we see here, for instance, is that US and European imports from China via GVCs have fallen since 2018. So it's not just imports from the US, but also European imports. And this just highlights how rising uncertainty in GVCs in general seem to slow the growth of GVCs, and they are a problem for GVCs, as we've also seen in the aggregate statistics that I showed you in the beginning. And while it's of course too early to say anything about what the impact will be on current events, the evidence that we have from the US-China and related trade policy conflicts, it doesn't look too good for GVCs. In terms of environmental shocks, what we find is that they, of course, tend to be more localized and temporarily confined, but nevertheless, they can spill over through GVCs. And as climate change progresses, these shocks will become larger and more frequent. So they will certainly enter more and more also the considerations of firms when it comes to where to locate and how to set up global value chains. And finally, with respect to the pandemic, what we find is that while complex and lengthier GVCs were particularly affected by the pandemic, GVCs have been surprisingly resilient in adjusting to the volatility in demand, in supply, the sudden changes in policies. Of course, the GVCs weren't able to adapt perfectly, but then again, there's no reason to believe that fully domestic production couldn't have adapted and hasn't adapted perfectly either. So in some, the evidence rather shows that having production organized through GVCs was extremely beneficial to respond flexibly and rapidly to the crisis. So that concludes the presentation of the key findings and brings us to the discussion with the lead authors of the report. And let me introduce them one by one. We have Joseph Maria Singhan from the Asian Development Bank with us, who is the lead author of Chapter 1. Yuqing Qing from the National Policy Institute, lead author of Chapter 2. Elisabetta Gentile, senior economist from the Asian Development Bank, and lead author of Chapter 3. Atal Solingen, who is a professor at UC Irvine and a visiting fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and lead author of Chapter 5, and Catherine Lundquist, from my colleague here at the WTO, lead author of Chapter 6. So we have a few questions for each of you, but I also encourage everyone in the audience to use the Q&A function. The chat function is disabled, to pose questions to the lead authors based on the presentation you just saw, but also questions you might have related to these topics in general. Now let me start with Joseph as lead author of Chapter 1. Looking at the trends in GVCs, this of course reminds us of the term globalization, which has been used to indicate that the expansion of globalization has been slowing in recent years. How do you capture this exactly? How in the report, and what do you think are the causes?
Okay, thank you, Victor, for the question. In the report, we use various indicators to capture the phenomena of globalization, and with its two phases. One is the hyperglobalization, the other one is the globalization. To go back to the basics, the definition of a global value chain participation is production processes that are fragmented and distributed around the world to take advantage of location-specific factor advantages creates global value chain. Now, a country or a sector or a firm can participate in global value chain by using intermediates produced elsewhere in their production processes and then contributing to the production processes of which they are part of. Now, to measure that, we make use of two measures. What we call the participation rate. One is based on the production, the other one is based on exports. The results of which were depicted in the graph that you showed. Now, between 2000 and 2010, what we call the phenomena that can be described as hyperglobalization, and then just after the global financial crisis, we saw evidence of globalization. Now, to understand what caused globalization, we should see what actually caused hyperglobalization. Now, since the late 90s, mid-90s, various factors contributed to rapid growth in globalization. That includes opening up by various number of major countries, China, India, Eastern Europe. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, which created various opportunities, and also improvement in production and transportation and communication technology. So many of the technologies that we use now were effectively brought into play in the late 90s and early 2000s, and major players that we see now in the field are companies that were formed in the late 90s and early 2000s. So that was a time where it was probably the right time for global expansion, both in terms of trade as well as in terms of the integration of new and modern technology into the production process, and also the distribution of distribution of production processes across the world. Now, it may have been a timing issue. However, since the global financial crisis, we may have so the countries may have taken a step back and started to look at to ensure that the production, the supply lines are kept secure. They may have started to reshore or slower the distribution of the production processes across the world. As you have already noted in the presentation, a lot of it has to do with the China, the slowdown in the globalization participation rate related to China. Between 2000 and 2010, the growth rate in their participation rate was about 20%, and then since then it has been only around 4%. That's largely because of various factors. Their key advantage had been in the first decade, the comparative advantage in the wage rates. Now it started to catch up with the productivity. The next one is related to the orientation towards local markets. It's more of an economic phenomenon rather than a policy decision, although policy decision may have played a role, because they are starting to basically looking at local production for local supply. And this also is a trend that we saw in United States, the other major economy. And again, as in the chart that you already showed, it's country specific. However, major countries have slowed their participation in global value chain, and it may have been related to various factors, but it's quite possible simply because of the fact that by 2008, 2009, 2010, the firms, the economies may have essentially reached a saturation point in terms of utilizing all the advantages there is, given the environment that we operate in. So that would be my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thanks, thanks a lot, Joseph. I'm sure we'll come back later to you. But let me pass the floor to Yuqing, the author of Chapter 2, because as I mentioned before, the report is entitled Beyond Production. I think Chapter 2 does a great job in highlighting why GVCs are moving beyond production. And could you explain exactly why or what Chapter 2 is doing exactly to highlight this?
Okay, thank you, Victor. Actually, we define the theme of the report as beyond production, because we think the task which beyond production are more important than the task of a production process. A typical GVC generally consists of pre-production task, production task, and post-production task. It is a multinational company which is specialized in pre- and post-production tasks to organize, operate, and gain a large share of value added. Nowadays, we talk about the restructuring of global value chain or the relocation of supply chain. So who decide how to restructure existing global value chain and where the supply chain would be relocated? It is a company who specialized in pre- and post-production tasks. Therefore, we think if we really want to understand the importance of GVC to the global economy, we should go beyond the production. You know, in chapter 2, we show that why this is so important. So that's why, you know, in chapter 2, we study how the intangible asset of a multinational company, which contribute to international trade extensively. Unfortunately, you know, current trade concept or trade statistic cannot record the extensive activity conducted by, we call it a factorless manufacturer. You know, traditionally, we have this kind of trade in service linked with intangible asset. For example, when Chinese company, Lenovo, install Windows operating system in all its PC. So Lenovo should pay the license fee to Microsoft company, that is American company. So this fee is automatically recorded as the US export to China in services. But when we look at this trading intangible asset along global value chain, the situation is completely different. Why? Because the owner of intangible asset, they do not license their intangible asset to foreign users. Apple is a typical example. Nike is another example. So those companies, they do not license their intangible asset to any foreign user, but they gain the income of their intangible asset by selling tangible products, which are manufactured by foreign contract manufacturers. For example, you know, like Apple every year sold millions of iPhones in China. So Apple captures the largest share of the value added of each iPhone sold in China. But because all those iPhones are assembled in China, therefore, the gain of Apple from its intangible asset embedded in iPhones, the design and the brand software, is not recorded as US export to China, but actually it is kind of trade activities. So this is a kind of new trade in intangible asset along the global value chains. So we think actually it is very important to extend the concept of international trade at the age of global value chain. And we think that we should reform international trade statistic by including the trade in intangible assets. So in order to do this, we had to look beyond this production. We should focus more on this intangible asset. You know, if we include this trade activity in intangible asset conducted by multinational company like a Tesla or factorless manufacturer like Apple, we can see the significant contribution of a global value chain, in particular, the contribution of intangible asset to international trade. This is very important. Why? Now we talk about the benefit of globalization or international trade to the global economy. But now there exists very extensive trade in intangible asset along the global value chain, but we cannot report or record any of those kind of statistics. As you know, Victor shows that, you know, official statistic recorded that China imported roughly 4 million mobile phone and PC from the US in 2018. But actually, Apple alone sold about 52 billion products in China. So it's a significant kind of a missing trade activity. So we have to rethink how we define international trade at the age of a global value chain. We have to think how to calculate the trade activity, in particular, those kind of activities by multinational company, which have used global value chain strategy for their global operation. So, like in our chapter 2, we propose a very general, concept that is completely new concept about international trade. It's called trade in factor income. This is kind of a new definition, go beyond the national border, because the traditional trade is defined by national border. But now, because of the development of a global value chain as well as globalization, a multinational company can locate their factor capital or intangible capital in any place of this world. So they can export their products from any country, not just from their home country. So how to capture this kind of trade activity? So we need a new measure. So trading factor income is a way to examine the bilateral trade flow through the income. That is, who captured the income eventually, because gaining income from a foreign market, that is a fundamental purpose of international trade. So I'd like to tell you that this background paper, that is the trading factor income, has been published in China Economic Review. So if some of you are interested, you can read that paper to understand more about the technical part to evaluate and the trading factor income. Yeah, that's all from me.
Thanks a lot, Yuqing. Moving on to Elisabetta as the lead author of chapter 3. As I've mentioned, this transfer in intellectual property and intangible assets has, of course, a lot of implications for upgrading through GVCs, and we've seen that through the closing and income ratios. And in the chapter, you discuss different types of upgrading: functional upgrading, non-linear upgrading, and how they've helped to close the income gap. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, thank you, Victor. So this is, I'm glad that we are, I'm answering this question immediately after Yuqing, because these two topics are very much related to each other. So our research shows that for developing economies in particular, economies that are interested in joining global value chains and stimulating growth and income convergence through global value chains, their imitation remains the most important driver of this phenomenon. And this is a problematic one, because multinational corporations, they are very happy to support innovation and upgrading in areas that are complementary to their core competence. But they are not so happy with innovation when it comes to areas that could directly challenge their core competencies. Hence, the increasing importance that intellectual property is assuming on global value chains, and as discussed by Yuqing and his co-authors in chapter 2. So what does that mean for developing economies? Developing economies are already battling issues like the lack of absorptive capacity. They don't have the human capital often. They don't have the institutional or physical infrastructure to drive innovation along global value chains. What they can do, they can imitate with the limitations that we talked about. There are indeed good news, though. We find that in the past maybe 2 decades, there has been a huge emphasis on functional upgrading. There is this slow process of starting with low value added assembly activities and gradually assembling increasingly complex components up to the point where a firm can basically produce any component that they need for their final product. But it's precisely the modular nature of the production process along GVCs that makes this process, this gradual upgrading process, no longer necessary. Why? Because firms can source the technological components that they cannot produce. They cannot produce them because they don't have enough technological sophistication, or just because it doesn't make financial sense to them. So by sourcing the components that they cannot or will not produce, they are then free to focus on activities, equally high value added activities, such as marketing, such as taking the product and adapting it to the needs and preferences of their local market, branding, all of these intangibles that really drive up the value of the product and that drive up the fraction of that value that is captured by the firm. So I think this is good news for developing economies, because contrary to the famous Asian tigers who had to, become global players by painstakingly going step by step in terms of sophistication, this is precisely the nature of global value chains that make this process no longer important, necessary, and the only way to reach increased sophistication of production. And another element that my co-authors and I really wanted to stress in this chapter is that too often we tend to think of innovation as what happens at the frontier. We tend to think of innovation as the ability to develop the next generation of products and services. But the truth is that there are other forms of innovation that are equally important, and I would argue even more important when we are thinking about developing economies. That's organizational innovations, which allow firms to organize themselves and compete effectively in a global arena. But also, and specifically for the case studies that we present in our chapter, marketing innovation, the ability to take a standardized product and to adapt it to the tastes, the preferences, the identity of your local market, to brand it in a way that makes it different from the sea of other products. That's an incredible tool that developing economies have available. And it does not require a huge domestic market to do that. We've noticed that with the increased regionalization of global value chains, these can become, in effect, regional efforts. And with this, I stop, and I hope that we can develop this concept further. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisabetta. Moving on to chapter 5 and Ethel. Of course, when we started the process of the 2021 report, we were not quite sure yet if it makes sense to even include that chapter. And then I felt like with every day as the report progressed, that chapter became more and more important. And of course, right now it's really spot on. But you analyze, of course, in particular, 3 different risks in the chapter: geopolitical, environmental, and health-related or pandemic-related risks. So how do you see that these risks are related?
First, I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Victor and everybody. Yes. I should say at the outset, thank you for mentioning that, Victor, that it was a real challenge to add the risks stemming from pandemic and extreme weather events to what was going to be a chapter on geopolitical risks initially only, and that's my area of expertise. But having gone through these updates in real time as the pandemic was an ongoing exogenous shock, was both a challenge but also an interesting opportunity. So let me address your question. The 3 meta risks to GVCs. Meta risks are indeed related. Well, first of all, I should say that all 3 risks to GVCs are on the rise, as are all 3 risks from GVCs. All 3 risks are becoming more predictable as we improve our understanding of the sources and mechanisms of each, which is something that we tried to elaborate on in chapter 5, the sources, mechanisms, and effects of each one of these risks. For instance, the way they're connected, The rise of protectionism and extreme versions of inward-looking nationalism and populism have not only affected GVCs directly, but also fueled geopolitical tensions. Or the pandemic. The pandemic not only affected and continue to affect normal GVC operations adversely, of course, even at this moment, but has also exacerbated geopolitical tensions or environmental threats. As we know, they also can fuel new pandemics. So clearly these meta risks create a vicious cycle. They in some ways reinforce each other. They create unfortunate synergies among them, and they compound their effects. We have a whole section on those compounding effects. Indeed, they generate additional risks, such as cyber attacks, cyber theft, and others that become part of this vicious cycle. Analytically, however, the geopolitical tensions that threaten GVCs, I think, are more foundational, and Victor alluded to that. In what sense? Well, because those tensions enhance uncertainty, decrease investment, increase bottlenecks, unleash retaliatory tensions, trigger contagion effects throughout GVCs, and so on and so forth, as we outline in Chapter 5. Furthermore, geopolitical tensions undermine the ability of states to cooperate in tackling climate change and in preventing future pandemics. And finally, the chapter was quite explicit regarding the compounded effects of all three meta risks and what must be done immediately to contain those risks to GVCs. Now, the chapter was concluded prior to the event of the last 2 months. And so I may have a word or two to say about that as well in the context of what we had, the conclusions we had in the chapter itself. I can go ahead and do that now or later, Victor.
Let's maybe move along with Catherine first, but I'm sure there will be questions in the Q&A and once we open it up. Thanks a lot, Ed. So let me just use that as a reminder that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, everyone in the audience, and please do so. So the last chapter, Catherine, of course, looks at digital platforms, which in a way is one manifestation of, how intangible assets are growing in importance. And what we've mentioned in the report is that one positive aspect of this is that they make GVCs more inclusive. So can you say a little bit more about this? What kind of digital platforms and how do they make GVCs more inclusive?
Yes, thank you, Victor, for the question, and thanks to everyone. I think building off of what's already been said, I think will be helpful as well. As Elisabetta mentioned, the modular nature of global value chains have made them more inclusive, especially for developing economies. But this holds for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises as well, and in terms of digital platforms. So the chapter itself has to trace a long map to try to get to the end conclusion about just how digital platforms can help make them more inclusive, because you have to discuss micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, how they interact, like what things they can do, how have GVCs changed. But in the end, the focus is in particular on e-commerce marketplaces. These are not the only digital platforms that have impacts on global value chains. In fact, global value chains themselves would not really function without the digital platforms that increase communications and can provide the technology and tools that make them possible. But e-commerce marketplaces are a particularly concrete example. And within them, because of the fact that global value chains have become more modular, it is easier to buy or sell a particular component or piece of something that's being produced in a larger context. These e-commerce marketplaces are also relatively easier to join for smaller businesses. They can sell only one product. They can sell they have search functions that are included that can make it easier for interested firms to find these products. They do have different requirements to participate, so there are sometimes challenges as well. Although they provide opportunities and can create a more inclusive atmosphere, they do have some drawbacks that are discussed in the chapter and in the background paper as well. So in that case, that's the role of, there are other roles that digital platforms can hold as well, like crowdfunding, crowdworking platforms, that is. There's the services component, which is also addressed earlier in the report itself. That's one way that they can bring in more players into these, providing other opportunities. So let me stop there, given the time constraints that we're facing.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. Yeah, so let's open it up to floors from the audience, to questions from the audience. And I guess I will always direct the questions to someone in particular, but feel free now to just pitch in at any point in time. And Atle, as you had foreseen, I can already see a couple of questions on the conflict in Ukraine. So why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about how you think this will affect the conclusions of the chapter?
Thank you, Victor, for that. So the chapter's conclusions stand. The chapter recommended immediate global vaccination against COVID, agreement on early warning systems on pandemic prevention, support for outward-oriented political economy strategies that are sensitive to equity and distributional considerations, a minimum global corporate tax, environmentally sustainable GVCs, massive reductions in greenhouse effects, all of that, right? Immediate shift to green technologies. And it did warn against inward-looking policies, extreme statism, mercantilism, and illusions of complete self-sufficiency, which are unrealistic, elusive, costly, inefficient, and frequently counterproductive. And then we go on the optimal way to reduce all three risks through multilateralism, compliance, reciprocity, transparency, all of those things stand. But GVCs have connected economies more deeply than ever before and in more intricate patterns. For instance, their dramatic growth coincided with the longest peaceful economic expansion in East Asia since World War II. So GVC interdependence may have raised the barriers to more severe interstate conflict. The alternative, which we may be facing, is a counterfactual world with no interlocking GVCs, and that would test that proposition. But caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. We may find the results of that counterfactual not very appealing. The conclusions stand, but let me add one thing about chapter 5. We focused on threats stemming from economic statecraft and economic coercion. It mentioned only in passing threats to GVCs emanating from war and military tensions. But we know from history that militarized interstate disputes, military threats, use of force, all of those are very harmful for the global economy. And Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and its impact on the global economy on GVCs are confirming that. The estimates of economic growth are down. GVCs are in disarray due to enormous uncertainty. Prices of inputs and raw materials are climbing, fueling further inflation, and much more. So the effects of war, not just economic statecraft, will become a crucial item in the research agenda on GVCs going forward. And this is an altogether different kind of exogenous kind of meta shock from the ones that we've looked in chapter 4. And this may be the worst kind of meta shock, especially when it invokes nuclear threats. I'm afraid.
Thanks a lot, Atle. Yeah. Related to this, we also have a question on the weaponization of connectivity. And Catherine, since you in your chapter also discuss essentially the threats of data security and so on. Maybe you can respond to that question, but Ethel, feel free to come in, or anyone else on this particular question. So yeah, what has been the impact of GVCs on the trend towards weaponization of connectivity?
Thank you, Victor. So it's mentioned in the chapter itself too, like obviously the first step towards being able to participate and having the GVCs be more inclusive is connectivity itself. Regarding weaponization of connectivity, that one is a step beyond what I spoke on, but obviously it's something that could happen. But regardless, there is the necessary first foundational aspect of having the infrastructure in place, having the knowledge of how to use that infrastructure, so the human capital in place. But data itself is a growing part of global value chains, and a part of this new digital global value chain that has created what's called an infomediary value chain. And that's in fact the data that is produced out of the platforms themselves. So if you think of an e-commerce marketplace, there's a lot of information in there that's crucial for businesses now. Who are you selling to? Where is it being sold to? What are your customers? These kind of data can lead to new products. They can lead to improved advertising. This is information that is key for the users of these platforms. And one of the issues in terms of the monopolistic nature of some of these platforms is whether or not you're able to transfer that data with you. If you were to switch from one e-commerce marketplace to another, are you able to take that information that your firm that was generated for the sales for your firm, can you bring it with you to another and continue from there? So these are things that policymakers will need to look into going forward. They're complex questions. I open the door. I allow people to consider them, I think, or that's what's hoped for with this chapter. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Yuqing, please come in.
Okay, I'd like to say a few words about the weaponization of connectivity. What I can think is the US sanction on Chinese high-tech company. As you know, we mentioned in chapter 3, the success of China's mobile phone industry is mainly due to its active participation of a global value chain. So Chinese mobile phone maker have been dependent on American technology. So that is kind of a connectivity due to the global value chain strategy. But now, because like a Chinese high-tech company, for example, Huawei, have been sanctioned by the US government. Therefore, their supply chain and or the value chain have been disrupted severely. So that's why, Huawei, this mobile phones market share fell sharply from 19% in the first quarter of 2019 to the 4% in the first quarter of 2021. So if this kind of weaponization of connectivity continue, then that will force, we talk about restructuring of a global value chain. So definitely that will call this kind of restructuring of a global value chain that may lead to parallel global value chain between the country who used to rely on American technology. Now, like China has to develop its own indigenous technology, like a Huawei launch its own Harmony operating system. So if Huawei is successful in the future, then we'll see additional operating system run on mobile phone or PC. So that would definitely not efficient at all.
Thanks a lot, Yuqing. So maybe let's move a little bit away from the questions on challenges and risks to something more optimistic, and in particular the opportunities from value chains. And Joseph, in chapter 1, you already identified that while the aggregate rise of GVCs has essentially stopped, some countries continue to enjoy significant benefits from the increased GVC participation. And could you also foresee in that context that the growing risks that we see also offer some opportunities to maybe developing countries that haven't been able to integrate into GVCs so far yet for different reasons, because these different trends might cause companies to shift production around, but at the same time, try to keep up the diversification of supply.
Thanks, Victor. So for GVC participation, for a country to get into various GVC networks, there are sufficient and necessary and sufficient conditions. And it's very hard to come up with a comprehensive list of sufficient conditions, but definitely what is necessary is pretty established. So first being a comparative advantage in some segment of the production process. The second would be stability and governance and protection of property and so on. If you go through the list of what is called the indicators of ease of business, you need to have a lot of those. Now, many of those factors can be taken advantage of. So it's easy for countries actually to make policies, set up infrastructure, set up systems, set up their policy framework to make their country competitive in various factors that contribute to the ease of doing business indicators. So this provides now the current conflict as well as the trade conflict and also a number of other geopolitical situations that is aptly described in Ethel's chapter, and who knows, there may be many more, could provide a chance for the countries that are hitherto not being able to participate in global value chains to seize the opportunity to develop these critical factors within their economy so that they can attract global value chains. So that would be a short answer to that question.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. And related to this, we also had a question on standards. And what they can do to help with development to GVCs. Maybe Elisabetta, you can help a little bit on this.
Yes, my short answer is yes. International standards are very, 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 very important in the development of global value chains. We talked about the modularization of manufacturing and how that has led to new opportunities for non-linear upgrading. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what we mean by modularization of manufacturing. So you have a schematic for a product, and you break it down into several components that don't have to be necessarily produced by the same firm in the same country, not even in the same continent anymore. So then you source these different components from multiple sources, and these components have to work together seamlessly, flawlessly for this process to be successful. So international standards are at the heart of a successful effort of this sort. It's very easy if we can provide like very, very, very simple examples of what we are talking about here. Is how many of you in your life at certain point you had to convert a recipe or a science formula from the imperial system because you are looking at the American manual or US book of recipe or whatever, and you have to convert it into metric. Everybody knows what the nightmare that is. Now imagine that has to be done in a factory, maybe in a different continent with respect to the supplier, when you're trying to source a component, and that component has to be integrated seamlessly in the product that the factory is developing. So this really ups the standards and the stakes quite a lot. So it is very important, just as we continue to eliminate barriers to trade, the effort to harmonize technical standards, production standards. Those are also incredibly important, and I thank the member of the audience who asked this question. They are incredibly important for us to continue to benefit from these advantages and even more. So one element, if you allow me, that I would like to add to what Joseph was very importantly saying before about opportunities for developing economies to enter into global value chains. There is one thing that I really would like to get off my chest. As I was mentioning before, there has been an incredible emphasis on functional upgrading, and at the Asian Development Bank, whenever you talk to our member states, they are always telling us, so how do I upgrade? How do I upgrade? So I don't want to take anything away from the importance of the process of upgrading. I mean, I'm not here to tell you that upgrading is not important, but I would like to shift my emphasis on another important issue, precisely because in Asia, I think developing Asia is a great example of that. Being able to successfully, reliably, and efficiently produce, assemble, and produce small, simple parts and components, and bring that up to a scale where you become the supplier to the rest of the world for that particular part is not something to be underestimated. This is what we call upscaling as opposed to upgrading. Developing Asia has created millions of decent jobs, getting people out of poverty this way. So I would say upgrading is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. So this is another message that comes from chapter 3 of the report. Being able to scale up, to really become the reliable supplier to the rest of the world of a specific part is very, very, very important. And this, as Ethel was mentioning, requires stability, security, and a peaceful environment. Thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Elisabetta. And these discussions are all very interesting, but we're already coming up, or we're coming close to the end of the webinar. So let me just pass on one question from the audience. And I would like every one of you to answer just very briefly before I pass it on for final remarks to Bob Koopman. And that question is, what can then WTO members or the members of the Asian Development Bank or any other policymakers do? What will be your one key policy advice that comes out of the report? Starting with Joseph.
Yeah, it's probably the big elephant in the room: improve the quality of governance.
Thanks, Joseph. Yu Qing. You're still muted. Yu Qing, you're still mute. You're on mute. Thanks. Perfect.
I think all the government should be open to global value chain, seize the opportunity of participating in global value chain, and provide inducive policy to nurture the environment for their firms' participation into the global value chain.
Thanks, Yu Qing. Elisabetta?
I would say education and training. I will never cease to repeat the importance of creating workers that are up to the challenges that global value chains, ever-changing priorities and ever-changing preferences present. So education and training and future-ready workers are the answer to being able to take advantage of the opportunities from global value chains. Thank you.
Ethel?
Yes, I think I actually already alluded to my the policy advice, but if I have to condense that, sensitivity to distributional considerations within and across states, green technologies, resolving issues of pandemic preemption, and I'll stop there.
And Catherine, last but not least.
So it's hard to follow up on that. It has to be a combination, I'm sure, of all of these suggestions. But I think most important is don't put barriers in place. Increase the level of training, just like Elisabetta said. Participants can join as long as they understand how, and that there aren't barriers to their access. It just shows that digital technology continues to change. It will continue. It's hard to put policy measures in place in advance of those changes, but in order to facilitate them once they come up.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone. This has been very insightful. We're just a little bit over time, so let me pass the floor to Bob Koopman, Chief Economist of the WTO, but also Chair of the Advisory Committee of the GVC Development Report, for some final remarks. Thanks, Bob.
Well, thanks, Victor, and thanks to all the speakers, Victor, yourself, Joseph, Yu-Ching, Eto, and Catherine. So before closing the webinar, let me end on some concluding thoughts. As we mentioned several times today, GVCs have been under a lot of strain since the financial crisis, from the renaissance of trade restrictive industrial policies to earthquakes. But of course, none of this compares to the past 3 years with the pandemic and now with the war in Ukraine. And while we firmly believe in the benefits of GVCs, and while the evidence clearly shows that GVCs were agile and resilient in the crisis, there's no denying that the system can and must improve in light of everything we've learned during the pandemic and in light of the changing geopolitical landscape. This, of course, requires more data and more analysis. The GVC Development Report 2021 provides many insights already, but much of the work was done during the pandemic and prior to the war. That is why we need to continue to work on this now, that more data becomes available and more linkages become apparent. Therefore, the next edition of the GVC Development Report will focus on building resilient and sustainable global value chains in a post-pandemic economy. In particular, we'll look in much more detail and with more data at how geopolitics, climate change, pandemics, and industrial policy affect GVCs and what can be done to improve resilience. And we'll also look at aspects of inclusiveness, because only inclusive GVCs are truly sustainable. I encourage each of you to reach out to the editorial committee of the report and to provide comments and suggestions. To conclude, let me thank Annabelle and the panelists for their excellent interventions and discussions, and everyone in the audience for attending. We hope that it was an insightful event, and we hope to see you again soon at one of our future webinars. Thank you all, and have a good day.